Seeing is believing. XR for communicating climate resilience. As I mentioned, my name is Greg Lindsay. You may have seen me at other activations at South by Southwest, like Inc. Founders House and the Fast Company Grill. But I'm here today to moderate a fantastic session on behalf of our friends at inCitu, who are one of the featured subjects in a report that I wrote for Cornell Tech in 2024 called The Augmented City, which was really sort of a foresight handbook and exercise for cities about the potential uses and also safeguarding against the abuses of XR and AI at urban scale. And so inCitu, which you'll hear a bit about here in the course of this, is a great startup and app that basically uses your phone, that uses WebXR to basically assist cities and other sort of civic bodies in helping show people the future or potential futures in the form of the built environment, whether that's new buildings and new infrastructure. And so we talk a bit about that later, but for the course of today's conversation, we're very happy to have two excellent experienced planners here from opposite sides of the United States, from Hawaii and from Florida here. Alan Clinton, as you can see here, is from the county of Kauai in Hawaii, and Sarah Vitale, who is here from Tampa, from the Tampa Bay region. And yeah, they're here to talk a bit about basically how they are using XR as a tool to convince residents of the need for basically climate-based adaptation in the built environment. And as we know, culture war is America's pastime now. So how can we use XR as a tool to build this kind of trust and as a communication medium to really convince people, to really, as the name implies, seeing is believing here, to basically make them aware and convinced of the necessity for adaptation. And so they're going to walk through some of their projects. We're going to talk a bit about some of their sort of war stories here about basically how do you win over people in this. And yeah, we're going to talk about how technology can be, as XR was famously said about by someone who said that it was an empathy machine. So how do we get back to that one here to really create empathy for our neighbors and for our communities and for the public servants who are helping trying to keep us safe? All right, so to get started here, there's a lot of visuals. We are the XR track and as well as the cities and climate track. So I'm going to hand it over to Sarah here along with our clicker. A few housekeeping notes here. I think I already walked into here. We're going to see a bit about flood resilience planning in Tampa. Then Alan's going to talk about his wildfire policy. The other title I had for the session in my head was Come Hell or High Water. And then we're going to get into a discussion. We'll open up to the audience here. We've got, maybe we'll come back to that QR code. We've got a Slido, but also maybe we'll keep it intimate and we'll just go around and have a great discussion as well, too. So thank you for joining us for the next hour. I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to get us started here. Point to your right there. You got your left?
Testing, 1, 2. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I think I could stand up. Is that, yeah? Okay, cool. I can see this better. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Vitale, urban planner in the Tampa Bay region. I work with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council, and we work across the 6-county region, 6 counties and 23 cities, on resiliency planning and other planning topics like cross-jurisdictional boundaries. And I'm excited to share with you all some of the work we've been doing in the flood resilience space because, of course, water does not follow those clear, nice jurisdictional boundary lines. It's a common issue across our local governments, and we're here to support planners primarily with different tools and methods for addressing this and for communicating risk in an effective way. Our region is extremely vulnerable to flooding from sea level rise. We're experiencing a foot of sea level rise since we started tracking it with our tide gauges. And of course, that's making our extreme intense storms and hurricanes worse, the impacts of those. A lot of our region looks just like this, people living right along the water. So a lot of my job, and I'll kind of tell you a little story about how my thoughts have changed in the risk communication space with planning. I started doing this job about 7-8 years ago, and around 2020, my job was really focused on convincing people that the risks were real. Our region hadn't been hit by a major hurricane since 1921. So there was a real sense of complacency among the public, even in staffing in the local governments, the electeds. They hadn't had that lived experience of dealing with a major storm. So I spent a lot of time kind of trying to convince people it was real, showing maps like this that show over 21 feet or more of sea level rise or related storm surge, tidal storm surge, if a Cat 5 came through our community. And will this work? Wonderful. We tried to make it so real that we even invented our own hurricane named Hurricane Phoenix, Category 5 storm that comes to Tampa Bay. And this is just a quick video showing you some of the work that we did. And a funny side story, later on, we experienced a hurricane, Hurricane Milton, that had a very similar track to Hurricane Phoenix. So similar to the point that our agency went viral, and I was getting calls from the news asking me to explain how we thought this could happen, and did we plan it? Is it a planned storm that you invented? It's kind of a wild story. But we ended up also thinking about using technology, and this is where I really can specialize in the 3D modeling. So we started looking at familiar places in our region and showing people what it could look like if it flooded. So this was created using twin motion and SketchUp, just showing the different water levels at different category hurricanes in a familiar place at the convention center in Tampa, somewhere that people could recognize. Now we're also exploring flood visualization using game engines, so moving from twin motion to another Epic Games product, Unreal Engine, and we're exploring what types of topography could best represent the real world. What types of data? Is it a LiDAR scanned terrain model, or is it a digital surface model? This is an example of trying both out and raising the water plane just to try to see which looks more realistic. And this one was with a digital terrain model. It sort of starts to match what you see in the actual aerial image of where the water's sitting. So we're starting to figure this out with the game engines. And also making interactive experiences using games for planning, trying to kind of cut through the noise and captures people's attention and make this a little bit more interactive and fun. And there's a lot of research to support that when you are interacting with something, there's this way that it affects your memory, and there's a lot of positive benefits to that. It sticks with you. So we're exploring all these different ways to consider flood visualization and communicate risk. We're also telling stories, and that's a really important part of all of this. We, at this time, hadn't been hit by a major hurricane, so we looked towards other parts of Florida that had. We told the stories of Michael Scogins from Killer Seafood, who his restaurant was damaged in Hurricane Michael in 2018, a Cat 5 storm that hit Mexico Beach. And his resilient story of how he's able to bounce back. His business has moved into a food truck as their immediate next step to keep their doors open. And instead of us just telling his story, we put the mic in his hand and we did a documentary series allowing him to tell his own story. And that was really impactful as well. So we're doing flood risk visualization with all these different methods. We're telling these stories in these different parts of Florida. But really, the best way for people to understand something is to gain that lived experience. And unfortunately, that's what happened in 2024. We got hit by 2 back-to-back hurricanes within 2 weeks. Hurricanes Milton and Helene, excuse me. And that was a real eye-opening experience for all of us in the Tampa Bay area, and then me personally and how I was communicating about risk. I spent a lot of time really just trying to convince people that this risk was real, and really focused on, honestly, the fear aspect of the climate communication. And it did get a lot of attention. It went viral. You know, it was a big thing that opened up people's eyes to the risks of it, but it was a bit of a downer. You know, this doomsday scenario of a Cat 5, you know, what do you do next? It doesn't help people imagine some of the solutions and what you can do about it after you are impacted. So that's where I found myself after 2024 hurricane season, thinking about my skills in technology and 3D modeling and how can we best imagine some of the solutions that are possible. A lot of times planners will communicate like this, showing really complex maps with big loaded jargon terms. And you know, this can be effective when you're talking to other planners, but planners sit in between the elected officials and the public, and we have this challenge of having to kind of translate all this information into a way that we can all understand. And I found that avoiding the jargon that's hard to follow can really be effective, trying to make it simple, communicating in simpler terms, not dumbing it down, but just making it more relevant to folks is a very important part of this. And then communicating visually is also critically important. So I wanted to show a lot of examples of what solutions could look like instead of just what the risks in the flooding could look like. So showing pictures of other people's success stories in adaptation, pictures of people who actually elevated their homes, because it's hard to imagine that something like that on the top left is even possible. But that's an example of someone who didn't want to move, and they decided they're going to elevate their homes. They're going to invest in and stay where they are. Showing different diagrams are important too. so people can understand the context and see beneath the surface, understand the systems at play in driving these weather forces and these water forces. And then showing before and afters, like the seawall at the bottom here, or what more of a living shoreline natural approach to resilience can look like with the mangroves. But again, this was all examples, and they're great, visual examples, they help, but they're in other places, right? So I started to realize that people can imagine flooding clearly. I learned that. They struggle to picture the solutions in their own backyards. So that is where we started to think more about communicating visually, of course, but like how do we take it to the next level? We're doing these design charrettes. We're trying to give planners the tools they need to communicate visually. This is where I started to learn more about AR, and the company inCitu came in to help us in trying to imagine how we can show people what this type of technology can do and how they can visualize resilient solutions in place. So that's me taking a LiDAR scan with my iPad at the living shoreline, and those videos were pretty quick. I don't know if you saw. But I put it into SketchUp and just modeled a living shoreline with some oyster rocks. So oysters can grow on there, and all of those seagrasses are part of the living shoreline system. And then, oh, there we go. I went over to a gray infrastructure seawall that the city is looking at investing in to raise, and thinking about other opportunities for adaptation beyond the gray infrastructure. Maybe a living shoreline approach makes sense, and it's one thing to tell someone what a living shoreline is, but it's another thing for them to be able to stand there at the seawall and see it in place and know exactly what it's going to look like and kind of see into the future in that way. So I really think that if seeing is believing, planners need to be communicating with tools that help really sell that so that people can see solutions where they live, not just in 3 months. It's going to take us 3 months to develop this thing. I want to see it right now, and these are the tools that allow you to do that. And then I'm most recently, and where this is going, is I've started to learn how to vibe code, the weirdest term ever. And I'm learning with AI how to build apps in ways I never thought I would. And I'm working on a 3D sandbox for our planning colleagues to be able to communicate with the public more effectively, allowing them to show with 3D models and in 2D and 3D what the risks look like, where the water levels can go in different scenarios. And then there's an immersive mode where people can, almost like a video game, kind of walk around their property to see what that new adaptive solution could look like and what it could really feel like, and where the water level would go in reference to your body. The water's at your shoulders, the water's at your knees, in this time frame, in this sea level rise scenario, at this category surge, bringing in all of those elements into a 3D sandbox where they can work with the public to be able to manipulate it in real time. And I think that interaction and participation really helps with trust, helps people feel like they're a part of the process and part of the solution, and they can understand and see what's coming. And that last video, will it go? Oh, perfect. So from the 3D sandbox, you can export images, videos, but you can also export GLB files, 3D files, so that I showed a picture of this same model in the 3D sandbox. People can export that and show it on site in AR and stand right next to the new elevated home and get a real sense of what that's going to look like right there on their property. So I think it's really important that AR is incorporated as a part of this long set of different tools. And it could be incorporated at the beginning of the process or at the end, like in this example, but giving people the opportunity to really see what's coming and believe in that solution is critically important. And I encourage you all, later on, I put a little elevated house right across the street when you walk out at the carport area, car drop-off. You can take a picture of this and then scan it later, and you can see what I'm talking about, because seeing is believing.
Thank you, Sarah. That is the best souvenir I can imagine out of this, Sarah. Yes, thank you for the soft applause for that. That was great. Well, I do look forward to delving in more into the communication because I did. My favorite part of your presentation is that in many ways the same electorate that believes government cannot do anything can also believe that you could literally plan a hurricane and execute it. So that is, I think, some of the dichotomy. And Alan knows this well as well because Hawaii and the ruinous fires there. Of course, there's all sorts of conspiracies around space lasers, I believe, associated with that one. So we'll talk about some of the communication challenges you both are up against. But first, Alan, your turn to show off, do a little show and tell here, and talk about how you're incorporating visualization in your strategy. So please, by all means.
All right, well, thank you much. I will similarly come up here because I think it'll be easiest for me to talk through some of these slides as well. So first and foremost, before I get started, I'm incredibly happy to be here considering I was given like 1 hour notice on whether or not I could actually come because of the severe weather event going on in Hawaii at the moment. Really happy that that damage was sort of constrained to particular areas and I was able to come and join you all today. This is probably one of my favorite photos to start off with. Granted, I will be discussing fire. Something we just adopted in Kauai was our first wildland urban interface zoning ordinance. So we brought fire mitigation regulations into our zoning codes via a form-based code. And so that will be the focus of my presentation today and how we use a variety of different technology tools to move that policy along while communicating a whole variety and suite of new types of regulatory and mitigation approaches to different types of structures and particularly vulnerable areas of Kauai. But I do want to first say, I'll put together a small little agenda where I'm going to have a short conversation just to introduce you to Kauai a little bit more. Then next on what we kind of refer to more regularly as just threading the needle. How do we navigate the politics? How do we navigate the law? How do we navigate the communities that we can arrive at a product at the end of the day that serves everybody in our community and meets the needs of our residents? From there, I will probably go into a little bit of discussion about what we're going to try to do in the future and how we're going to be moving forward with not just regional-based approaches for wildfire mitigation, but island-wide approaches as well. So what we have here, just to reference everybody, Kauai is one of the 4 counties that compose the state of Hawaii. We are on the far northwest side. The island of Kauai houses the majority of our residents. It's the largest island in that large red circle. Niihau and Ka'ula are off to the left, but they do not have sizable populations. So we'll prominently be talking about Kauai today. For those of you who are familiar, Lilo and Stitch was based off of, inspired by Hanapepe Town on the west side of Kauai. It's a really great way to familiarize yourself a little bit if you haven't been there. However, who's here seen Yellowstone? Anybody seen the show Yellowstone? I would actually say Kauai is a little bit more like Yellowstone. We do not have the gun violence, shooting, and death, but as far as the interaction amongst the stakeholders present in that show, from indigenous populations, the millionaire and billionaire class, recent transplant residents, tourists as well, and environmental concerns that are raised very regularly in the interaction with different government leaders and stakeholders, much more representative than Lilo and Stitch, the dynamic of a much more rural area that you would see from the interactions of a show like Yellowstone. But I want to bring it back to this photo because this is a great launching point for the challenges of stakeholder discussions. What many people see here is a shoreline, but what this represents to me is 4 very different extreme stakeholder groups to balance a very complicated dynamic environment. This is a county-owned beach park. You have a landing strip at the top, so there's federal regulations. The highest wash, the highest wave, the highest tide on a disaster event counts as state property. And then you also have pa'akai harvesting, so native Hawaiian salt harvesting on the image to the left. So you have 4 very challenging stakeholders that you need to navigate to achieve a complex solution to address mitigation solutions to preserve, protect, and prepare the communities of Kauai for the 21st century. And so that sort of brings me to this discussion about threading the needle. Is we have a very unique geography in Hawaii. There's a very complex legal geography, a very complex cultural geography, and a very complex physical geography that come together with all these stakeholders, multi-jurisdictional boundaries, makes collaboration very challenging. And so in the process of trying to develop new regulations and protocols, communication is so incredibly key, and we certainly use a variety of different technology tools and inCitu to help bridge the gap amongst all these different stakeholders. We most certainly also have our own coastal hazard problems. We don't like houses falling into the ocean. That's a bit of a problem. We have plenty of flood events as well. Every hazard possibly known to man. We even have tornadoes, believe it or not. But every hazard known to man, including volcanoes, you name it, we've got it. And so living with hazards and being mindful of geodesign is incredibly critical in a place like Hawaii. And you'll also notice that one thing I will point out is there is a lot of damage that creates some pretty substantial issues when it comes to insurance. This is going to be a theme I come back to time and time again. The photo on the top left is the remnants of the Lahaina wildfire. The photo on the bottom left is from the Palisades in LA. And on the right side, you can actually see a localized fire that we had on Kauai that neighbored one of our very precious communities, which is known as a plantation camp community following a community that formed out of the sugar plantation era. But while the sugar is no longer an active industry, the community still remains. But they are now surrounded by fallow agricultural land that has been overrun by invasive species. Hawaii is not an ecosystem similar to the Pacific, the western region of the United States, that is a fire-adapted ecosystem. Fire is a new hazard in Hawaii based off of invasive species and plants. And so there isn't necessarily a natural process for fire to play in the Kauai ecosystem. And that presents a lot of challenges from a mitigation standpoint in trying to find solutions once again, because there are not known solutions and mitigation efforts that were historically employed in the area. So the community that we're going to discuss today, where we created our first wildland urban interface ordinance, is in a community called Kamakani Village and Kamakani Avenue on the west side of Kauai. I personally think this is the most remarkable community on the entire island. Remarkable, there's like this house right here. There's a outdoor bonsai garden. Doesn't need any type of greenhouse or anything to thrive. There's very clear ownership from community members, care, and this community is surrounded by fallow agricultural land and is the one right here adjacent to where this fire occurred. And this image is one of the most powerful photos I have to communicate the value of mapping and aerial imagery, because you can literally see how human intervention played a huge role in the way that this fire moved. The fire literally wound its way down here between two actively managed fields because they were actively managed and not left to sit to fallow agriculture. And so what we learned from this is that there are things that we can do from a mitigative standpoint to limit the potential spread of wildfire in these areas. And so we've been learning a lot. For the last, I would say, probably 2 decades, we've been focusing on density, density, density. How do we get more housing in particular areas, additional rental units, additional dwelling units? We've been trying to maximize our density, and so more buildings and more space, but that turns out to be fuel when a fire starts raging through a community. And so now we're having to backtrack and reevaluate our fire hazard standards and try to understand what we can do to prepare our built environment so we do not have a Lahaina type event on Kauai. This photo is one of my favorites, just to point out some of the different ways that fires move, basic home defense, and this is probably a fantastic photo of some of the basic things that you can do to a home from a home hardening standpoint, from a wildfire mitigation standpoint at low cost, that goes from small little embers completely engulfing a house to one still standing. And so those are the things that we focused on in our ordinance. But that means a lot of communication, working with the building industry, understanding costs, figuring out how that can be achieved. And so this is roughly where we kind of had to navigate to. The top left is sort of what these homes looked like, rendered prior to our mitigative requirements that we evaluated. And then the home on the bottom right represents an example of one of these housing units following the adoption of the ordinance requirements. The very big thing that you can notice is this 5-foot concrete buffer That is very clearly the most expensive thing that we added to protect a home. What we learned very early on is that 5-foot zone from your house to 5 feet away. During a high wind event, little eddies occur where the fire embers just circle right around by a house in that 5-foot area, creating a really problematic combustible area. And so this is one of the most effective things that can be done to limit a fire from engulfing a new home. Many of the other things that were a bit more hard to see, metal roofs, Class A roof types, fire mesh underneath the house, moving from post-on-pier construction of wood to concrete, and a host of other elements. But you can see there's a pretty dramatic character change between these two structures in a very, very historic community. And so we went through a process starting with ArcGIS Urban and moving forward to a variety of different tools, including the Unreal Engine and inCitu, so that we could show the potential change to these communities on web-based platforms, in VR, as well as in AR, but maintaining thematic consistency of those models between all the different methods that we use to communicate these changes. And so that was incredibly critical because you never know when one stakeholder needs it visualized in one particular way, shared in one particular way, or another. And in a small local government environment, it's very, very, very critical that we meet all of the communication needs of those folks in our community so that they're all on the same page and moving in the same direction. And so we very regularly throughout this process tried to ensure that we were using the same models as we were going through the process of developing a new policy and a program. And ultimately with the goal of moving those directly into the ordinance. This year, these are two little images of when we first started to put this 5-foot zone around a house so people could understand what they look like, how far away that is, what the impact could potentially be. And from there, we refined this a little bit more, brought these models back into some of our other Unreal Engine spaces. This is in the new XR scene viewer from Esri, but these models here are trying to replicate that 5-foot eddy of embers that occur near the base of a house during these high wind events, and continually making sure that we have the right graphics visualizations to help communicate consistently in the same way across all of our platforms of what the potential risks are and why these different mitigative actions are being proposed. This is just another example of the same model being viewed in VR in a multi-review space from multi-users. And we really had a lot of internal use for the VR systems, but the AR systems and the web-based platforms were particularly valuable for community outreach and those who did not have a headset, of course, but could still make use of the same type of deliverable and platform. And so here is an example of the structure that we put together for people to place in their neighborhood, their community, to understand these different zones. That 30-foot zone is actually a vegetation maintenance area as well. Let's see if we can get this to go. We actually put this in Petco Park in San Diego during the last Esri conference to help people understand what this would look like and the potential impacts. I'm sorry, I'm not sure whose children were there fighting on the ground at the end. But this has been a really useful tool, and particularly using inCitu in order for people to understand sort of the magnitude of what is being proposed, as well as for our policymakers when it's in their hands at our council. These are just some graphics, once again, using those same 3D models that were finally embedded into the actual ordinance at the end of the day. And so once again, the goal was to maintain that thematic consistency all the way from project conception into the adoption of the ordinance so that our legislators, our stakeholders, our policymakers knew exactly how to trace the development pathway from conception idea all the way into the ordinance at the end of the day. So this was adopted, this ordinance, about in September. And since then, we've been getting a lot of interest in whether or not these mitigation actions are too cost prohibitive, too challenging, whether or not these should be done island-wide. Right now, they are constrained to a particular special community on the west side of Kauai. But we've been asked by our mayor to look forward to doing an island-wide ordinance. If you remove that 5-foot concrete buffer and use another method to limit vegetation growth in that area, the added cost of construction for these home hardening requirements is only $3 extra per square foot. So it was not a substantial increase to the most effective fire mitigation practices that you can employ if you remove that 5-foot concrete skirt around the house, which we estimate anywhere between $15,000 to $18,000. Remove that single piece, those mitigation costs go down quite significantly. So we'll be looking at that moving forward. And the next sort of iteration of this is going into even more high fidelity visualizations and taking really high fidelity models such as these of our two most invasive plants on Kauai, Palikoa and guinea grass, and use different render engines to replicate the environment to help communicate to our community what ideal vegetation management and maintenance looks like, and how they can best proceed to manage fallow agriculture land and neighboring areas. We just got a $1 million grant from FEMA from the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, so we hope to move forward quite with a lot of momentum on these subjects right now, and hopefully we'll be sharing in a couple more years a full digital twin of the island that really focuses on vegetation, fire mitigation, and how we can sort of reduce potential loss of critical and residential infrastructure. That's all I got.
Soft round of applause for Alan. Come on. All right, so Nick, please do me a favor if you could rewind. All right, great. For that, we have the Slido set up here. So yes, so for folks, I know there's more expertise in this room than there is in my individual head. So I have a few questions for them, but then we'll simply open it up for questions there. Assuming I still have my phone on my person, that'll take you to Slido where you can submit questions and upvote on the other questions, and we'll start picking them out of there and so forth. So that way we don't have to do a show of hands. Sorry? Yeah, all right. Yeah, we'll take this any way you like. But we'll start up in 10 minutes here. I'm not gonna wait until the very, very end and squeeze in 3 minutes of questions. I want to hear from all of you. But obviously, I want to start with the two of you for like the obvious question to me, which is, I mean, this is obviously amazing, the techniques you're using here. But given we're talking about XR in particular, and if we accept Marshall McLuhan's idea that the medium is the message, how does XR change the message to that? How is it different from other communication tools? I mean, Sarah, you've got testimonials, you've got fictional hurricanes. How is XR different, and how does it change the texture of the conversation with the people when you're showing it to them? Like, just from an anthropological standpoint, from how do they believe it more, and why? Why does it differ from other tools?
Yeah, so I mentioned the storytelling, and that was a really impactful part, making sure that you're leading with the human stories. But even then, it's hard to really connect with someone's story if it's somewhere else and it hasn't happened to you in your own community. And I think that's where the AR really can play to our strengths, because you're not only able to show them, what could happen and what that solution could look like, but you can show it to them right there in their backyard at their own living shoreline or living seawall, and they can stand next to it. So I think it's just the physical embodiment that you get when you use an AR tool versus just looking at a 2D map or a 3D map. Like, it's just something different that really catches their attention, and it allows them to interact with it in an entirely new way. And people are starting to become more familiar with AR and the QR codes and all that, but it's still pretty unusual in local government. So I think that that's another real aspect that's a strength for us, is just trying to catch their attention, and then if they can buy into the solution, because people don't read, you know what I mean? So it's like getting them to really open these plans. If that can be the entrance with these AR tools, then they're more likely to pursue some of these solutions. And if we do all this planning and no one reads our stuff anyway, like, it's kind of a waste of energy. So using tools like this is a great way to get it into their face, and then get them to bring it back home into their own backyards and see those solutions in place.
All right, well, just a quick follow-up to that, and I want to hear from Alan as well, is how do you fold that into your communication and outreach efforts? I mean, do you have someone who is completely trained in inCitu who then walks them through it there? How do you structure that as part of your engagement with the community versus just like giving them a QR code?
Right. I think it's important that you have someone there to explain like how this works. We've shared it at a different conference and showing the planners themselves how this works so that they can play that role in their own communities. That's really where I fit into this, and instead of kind of overstepping them. I'm giving them the ability to kind of bring this into their own communities. But I do think it's important that someone's there to show them how it works and then explain to them the purpose behind this cool visualization. It's not just this novel tool. There's an entire planning process around it, and that their feedback is important, and that person's there to then collect that feedback. Yeah, that's pretty critical.
And then Alan, same to you. I mean, how do you couch that, particularly given the local sensitivities in this too? I mean, is this someone where you recruit someone from the community who's been trained in this to do this, or how do you structure that as part of a complete messaging campaign?
So overall, this is a trust conversation at the end of the day. And I think one of the ways in some sense that we can limit the amount of communication that comes out of my mouth as a planner is by giving the folks in the community the ability to choose their own context. They can take our models, our information, and apply it to a place that they already know. We struggle mightily when we introduce people to VR environments where we say, we're replicating a place that already exists. Because as soon as they see an environment and see something wrong or doesn't look accurate or correct, they will start questioning it to a degree that you may not be able to pull them back in and develop that trust. And so the AR context, when applied correctly, is really, really key. Particularly when we're talking about these massive, challenging, inconvenient data that we communicate, it can be a burden if you do not provide solutions in a toolkit for them to identify the challenge, and if you do not provide a solution to that issue, you just are burdening them with information that they can't act on, and that does not help us address our mitigation concerns and make us more resilient as a community. And so I would ultimately bring this back and say, first and foremost, this is a trust conversation, and giving people the ability to add, pretty much take a menu of options and apply it to a space that they're comfortable with is just the most important step.
All right. So if this session is really about trust and building trust, then it would logically imply that there's a general lack of trust, perhaps, by the public of this. And I'm sure if you have self-selected to join us here on this beautiful Monday morning here at South by, then you are familiar with and maybe have watched in horror at some community outreach meeting that has gone off the rails as various NIMBYs obstruct and offer criticisms, usually renderings of projects that people find very narrow things to nitpick. And this, of course, contributes to, I would argue, I don't think very controversially, that America has a lot of problems right now of getting public buy-in to build anything. And so I would love to hear from each of you, again, what's an example of something that has gone off the rails with more traditional approaches in communications, and were you able to talk them off the ledge, so to speak, using XR? How does that change the tenor of those conversations in there? So again, Sarah, if you want to go first here, like I can only imagine, if dealing with Florida Man has got to be a whole thing unto itself.
Yeah, I guess, and there's the AR aspect to it, but I'll just start with risk communication generally. I think there's some really clear goals that you might have in mind, and I like to think of this acronym simple, actionable, local, and transparent, SALT life here in Florida. And I like to approach it making sure that I'm using the right type of language, so I'm not losing Florida Man. Like, I'm using more simple terms, not dumbing it down, but framing it in a way that's really, it's gonna speak to what they value most. So let's say they're a commercial fisherman. I'm not gonna approach them with the science first necessarily. Sometimes that sounds like compliance first in their mind. Oh, I'm gonna have to change the way I do things. You approach it from their perspective. The pollution in the water, it's leading to a negative impact on fisheries. You're noticing this now. Long term, this is gonna impact you in these different ways. I'm not talking about 2050, 2080, that doesn't matter to somebody. You wanna put it in a way that is simple and that they're gonna identify with quickly. Actionable, focusing on the solutions, that's where the XR can really be helpful in that space because they're seeing something in an entirely new way in their own place. Local, it's a lot more impactful if they're seeing it in their backyard versus some random diagram or some random other city long into the future. And then transparent, just explaining, there's a lot of distrust, explaining how we came to these conclusions. You don't have to go in all the details of the science, but explain that some of the background and how this information is collected, and kind of bringing them into the process of developing the solutions together is also really helpful for transparency, so people kind of feel like they're involved in these solutions.
Is there just another follow-up? Is there like an aha moment where that happens there? Can you see? Because of course, just presenting information is not ever winning an argument. It is a question of like some crossing this chasm of distrust, where you're framing it in terms that they are willing to emotionally accept and believe. And again, is seeing believing in that regard, or is it how it's coupled together? What have you seen in terms of that?
I think there's the seeing is believing emotional aspect to it. I think it's just helping them to connect the dots about these climate impacts, extreme weather. Like all of this isn't some long, far out into the future problem. Like it's happening right now, and these are the different ways that, in your experience and whatever background you're interested, trying to understand their values and what matters to them, like trying to frame it in that perspective is really what helps move this forward. Instead of kind of describing climate change as some abstract concept, it's like really framing it to what values to them. Are they a parent, right? Like, you know, instead of just saying 2070, like talk about how this is when your kids are going to be adults. Like it's really not that far away in the grand scheme of it all. I think those are the types of things that help move these ideas forward.
Great. Alan, I want to hear particularly given I loved your Yellowstone slide. I wasn't sure when I was looking at the deck what that was supposed to represent. But yeah, this idea of radically different stakeholders in this one. How do you do it through the same frame there in terms of how you alter your messages, how you appeal it to them in that regard, and try to manage that very multivariable context?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge challenge, obviously. One thing I'll say to preface my comments on this is we very regularly, from a planning perspective, we plan on 2D maps from a bird's eye view 10,000 feet above the ground. But we all live in a three-dimensional space, so why do we plan on a two-dimensional plane from a bird's eye view? It seems very impersonal, and in some way, I don't think it's a very transparent way of communicating, because ultimately it can be very misleading if not everybody shares the same spatial context and frame of mind. And so that's where this comes back to not to the 3D element and then plus the augmented reality elements, is that we want to help make it a lot easier to plan in 3D for people to think in 3 dimensions in their natural space. And by using these tools, we can give them sort of, once again, that toolbox of options so that they can kind of workshop what they think would be best for them and their family. And so I think Sarah hit the nail on the head when it came to just being very thoughtful about multimodal communication from a whole variety of, and what we've learned, especially from our colleagues and friends who focus in on disability advocacy, is if you plan for all members of the community, it helps everybody in a whole variety of different ways too. If you create ramps, it makes it easier for people to bring to use everything from carts to shopping carts to strollers, everything. If you make the environment more accessible for our more vulnerable populations or communities, you make it more accessible for everyone. And so we're trying to also apply that type of perspective to the way we communicate, both verbally and visually as well. And so I think that's where I'd begin. But to specifically answer your question, Greg, we've really had to be mindful about moving away from open mic community meetings. We now have really transitioned to open house style events where it is not really productive or helpful for us to have one person having a dialogue with a group of government officials. And so now we have a much more intimate way of interacting with our community members, where we may have a room this size filled with different stations on different subjects, and staff manning each one who can go through an example, use a QR code to show them a particular hazard, do it on an individual basis. It's more resource intensive from a human labor standpoint, but by all means it helps diffuse and bring down the temperature in a room, so that you can have a lot more critical and helpful conversations amongst sort of a variety of different stakeholders from a diverse range of viewpoints. So we've had plenty of meetings that have devolved, and retailoring them to the right size has just been critical.
Yeah, having that right combination of high tech and high touch, I can imagine. All right, well, I will start opening up the questions. I have one more, but folks, here, take a mic if you have questions here. We'll start feeding them in here. But I want to ask each of you, what is in the bag of tricks that you have, not just XR, but in simulation, game design, everything else there, that you found the most surprising, or in terms of resonance, or where someone really delighted in it. Before we came up here, I was joking to Sarah that that provided it ever ships, someday she'll have Grand Theft Auto 6, set in the fictional state of Florida to use as an environment to show this stuff off. And I was also reminded just now thinking about that. I played the original SimCity, and like the most fun you could have with SimCity was triggering combinations of fires, floods, and then Godzilla coming as well too. So what's your kaiju mitigation strategy? But you can have this real fun, and it really invokes imagination. So I don't know if you have an example there of like the most fun you ever had, or like where someone was delighted by like thinking about climate disaster mitigation. Anybody got a story?
The first thing that comes to mind is just we've experienced a wow moment where we hit. Let me backtrack a second. Transitioning from 2D to 3D seems a little bit straightforward in some sense, but the expectation on level of detail goes through the roof when you start saying we're now presenting you information in a way that is very personal, but the level of detail needs to go through the roof for people to feel comfortable with those models oftentimes if they truly want to believe the fidelity of them and the accuracy of them. We hit a moment with that last slide where I showed those models in the Unreal Engine of those plants. That was the first time where it's not like we were tricking people intentionally, but people started asking, where is that? And that's when I knew we hit the level of detail required to move forward with our full 3D deployment. Is that we didn't have to, I didn't have to prompt them or anything. They're like, where on Kauai did you take that photo? And that's when I knew the fidelity of our models and the fidelity of our GIS that underride it met together. And so there's a bit of a nexus point that set the benchmark for what our workload looks like to be effective in the 3D space and in the XR space. So I'd say that was probably my wow moment, or a moment where we hit a critical point that I felt confident that it was worthwhile to invest human resources, time, and money in these initiatives.
Great. All right, I got some audience questions. Thank you for those who are submitting to the Slido here. We'll dive in a few of these. Quick question, if you could both talk quickly, sorry, I should be using the mic. If you could both talk quickly about the associated costs of developing this level of XR. Are these faster, cheaper, quicker, lighter prototyping tools, or does it require some investment in this regard? If you guys could address that quickly about how this stacks up against other tools in the kit.
I'll jump in. So we're always looking for cost-effective resources, right? I work in government. We don't have a huge budget for these things, so it's important that we're exploring open source and other types of open tools. I think the biggest barrier isn't as much the cost, but the technical capacity of staff and just upskilling staff. I think there's an investment cost in that, making sure that you have the right people that are willing to learn these different tools. That's where I think the biggest barrier is. In terms of hardware, there can be some, when you get into the heavier types of Unreal Engine and things like that, there can be some hardware costs, but it's an investment. But yeah, like I said, it's the training and upskilling of staff. I like to think that planners are coming out of school with some of these graphics and technical skills under their belt. That seems to be a trend, and I think it's important. But in general, like inCitu, SketchUp, they're not super expensive. It's just learning the 3D modeling skill set, and once you get started, it can be pretty fun, and then you're on the road.
This is a great question I love to answer because I came to South by Southwest 2 years ago and saw inCitu do a presentation, and for years and years, I'd been looking for a lightweight web-based app that AR that wasn't going to break the bank, that I had to go to my legislative entity to request a budget. And so having this package for a year be less than $2,500 was exactly what I needed to hear, because downloading an app is too much of a barrier for our community members. And so I needed to find a product that was right-sized, didn't have to download an app, and didn't break the bank. And having the technical skills in-house made the inCitu our go-to. There was no other option, quite frankly.
All right, great. I will alternate between in-person questions and the Slido, so please go ahead.
I'm in the arts, and we create content that sometimes is related to climate and awareness. So I guess you don't have the metrics, but to me it's always a question of what actually moves people to some kind of greater awareness and therefore maybe call to action. So do you have any sense of this interactivity? Everybody's calling for interactivity. I'm just a little suspicious that you have kids in the room like touching something goes blah, 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 and they are moved. So, but people are very impatient now, and honestly, people who commission content are impatient. So what's your analysis of where's the real buy-in when you're interactive? I mean, telling stories is key, but then what's the other real gets them to really buy in, if you have a sense?
So a couple months ago, it was actually the first time I had done this, and I was kind of a little nervous leading up to it, but I went to a city council meeting for a small city in our region, and I brought my 3D modeling technology to the meeting and did like a digital charrette. So I had the city council people, the elected officials, involved in the conversation, guiding the process of 3D modeling in real time. So they're able to tell me what they want to see, and I'm sketching it right there, then and there, in person in 4D. And I think that was something that they had never really experienced happening in one of these boring like Thursday night meetings. And I think that was something that I would like to keep doing, because I think there's a lot of success in doing those types of live charrette-style engagements, using the digital technology, the game engines, and allowing them to be a part of that process in real time. So to answer your question, I think interaction is key. And instead of doing it, in your office in the back room, like try to bring it into the light and do it with them, and that they're able to see the entire process and be a part of it.
Alan, I want to take this question and marry it with Mariana's. Thank you, Mariana, for your question here about really indicators to track results of this. Like, what are the measurable outcomes out of this? Or how would you value this as success?
So this is the question I was asking myself, because I need to ultimately communicate to my boss, our mayor, the council, that this is worthwhile and a useful technology to use. And I would say about 3 years ago, I couldn't find really high quality peer-reviewed studies or journals or things like that were evaluating particularly VR and AR tools. Were they doing scientific studies to evaluate analog versus digital ones, learning metrics, outcomes? And there's a professor at University of Central Florida, Maria Harrington, that I've been following for quite a while, and she was one that I looked towards, who also tries to balance the human element, so to speak, of these experiences with learning and evaluate that in a sort of a scientifically rigorous way that's been peer reviewed. And their findings were fascinating, where initial learning centralized more around the mean for people who were using the digital tool compared to an analog version of the learning program, but they also evaluated how people felt about their experience. And the people who were using the digital tool, their feelings about their learning it skyrocketed. And that's something that Sarah was alluding to earlier, is that the way you feel about these experiences does help with retention and information retention. And so that was a really critical thing for me to learn. And then one of the other small anecdotes on that front that you'll hear if you watch one of Dr. Harrington's presentations is, if you create the experience in a way where people are discovering it, or they identify with it, and like they turn over a rock and then there's a salamander, and that's new information. If there's a sort of an emotion of exploration or shock or new information, then the information is retained better. And so I think that is sort of a best way I can answer that question, is that's how I'm framing that. Yes, this has value, but we have to be intentional about, once again, contextualizing it for our community members. And so that could look a variety of different ways depending on fire mitigation, flood, or if you're evaluating microorganisms. But yeah, it was really fascinating that those studies are starting to come out that validate some of these.
Thank you, and thank you for the work you do.
Thank you very much for the question. Sir, go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Ernesto. I come from a branding and storytelling background. I run a design studio, and I'm helping folks working in climate to evolve into new narratives beyond like just kind of delivering the facts and getting that emotional hook. And I love the work you're doing. I'm curious, what would be your dream vision for implementing your tools at scale? I know that there's a lot that can happen in the in-person connection, and there's barriers to people downloading the app, right? But to make this self-guided and outside of your communities, is it like a video game where you can explore and learn, or like speculative docu-series, what have you? I'm curious.
So I'm working on that 3D sandbox. I showed a clip of it in the slide. That's a new prototype, and then if you're interested in giving feedback, I'd love to share it with more people. But I would love to see that become something that's a decision support resource for our local governments and actually being used day to day to communicate effectively the risks related to climate change with the solutions. So allowing planners to drop in different 3D models or upload their own and then export to AR these different models in the little diorama that they've designed that supports the planning concept they're trying to communicate. There's a lot of barriers, and I mentioned one with the technical literacy and capacity internally, so a lot of this stuff gets outsourced. I'd love to create a tool that doesn't require us to outsource all of these things, to kind of develop that skill set internally, save some tax money, save some time, because every time we outsource something, it just drags the project on, increases the budget. So yeah, making this 3D sandbox take off and be a really useful tool to get these ideas out there would be really, really my dream.
All right, Alan, you get another wrinkle here because I'm going to weave in another question here, an anonymous one. People's memories are short. How do you sustain attention on preventative measures? So you mentioned you want to go county-wide, but also how do you think of it in terms of time and a journey? I mean, you just want them to basically adapt to the code and then you're done, or is this an ongoing campaign as you evolve it? How do you maintain that access along time as well?
Yeah, so marrying those two questions together, we're right now operating in the space where the Lahaina fires and the fires in LA have occurred within very recent memory in the last 2 to 3 years. And the recovery is going to take decades, quite frankly. And that but we are already starting to see some fatigue, quite frankly, of those events, those disasters. We had a statewide one that I just barely missed, preventing me from coming to this event. And so that really is critical. And one thing I didn't elaborate on too much in the presentation was the locations that adopted this wildland-urban interface. They do have vegetation management requirements, and this was over an area that has one very large landowner that pretty much handles the entire community. So we were able to work directly with their management folks that they have to do community cleanups, they have to do community awareness and education, and particularly on evacuation routes. And so this is something that, to your question, sir, the conversation about what is next, so to speak, is we similarly want to create that platform that people can put their own information, their own models, their own stories onto. But on top of that, we want to use that platform to be very strategic on evacuation routes. And this is something that is really challenging because what we've learned from many of these urban conflagration fires, these massive fires, is that there were a lot of places where there were evacuation routes that people did not use, because if you're not familiar with that route normally, you're not going to use it when your life is in peril. Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes there's a gate, there's a fence, there's something preventing you from using it on day-to-day operations, but we can create, using these tools, we can create very specific and tailored experiences for people to navigate that area, even if it's not open on the day-to-day. We can help people understand. We have an entire emergency management system where we help people understand if there's a fire approaching, ready, set, and go, and what they're responsible for doing at each of those stages. Mm-hmm. Is it at ready, you alert your neighbors, you get your go bag, and then when that, in the UI, when you get that, you have to go, you navigate over, you unlock the gate with the text that came from the manager, and you can navigate and help people get to the highway and make it to a particular location of refuge. So that's sort of an example there where we're trying to create sort of the platform for people to add to also, but we're going to be very intentional and specific on something like an evacuation route where we realize that a lot of lives are lost in that particular instance. And so I'm not sure if that perfectly answered your question, but in some sense, trying to hone in, contextualize very specific elements as well as sort of broad and specific at the same time. That's a terrible answer, but trying to create the platform and also very tailored solutions.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
All right, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to do like a combo question lightning round. We're going to do what we get here. So as someone pointed out, one of the questions we have here, is that some of the household level mitigation measures you both showed are unaffordable for people who are often the most vulnerable in flooding and wildfires. So these question of cost of your options, and I want to tie this into two other things. So Sarah, you showed earlier in your presentation, a shoreline. We put in a seawall. We put in an adaptive seawall. I'm curious, taking those kinds of options. What kind of capabilities would you like to have next in your tools to bring in other information sets to help make decisions? So, for example, I was thinking idly there that I would love to have a filter that you could show, electeds or show someone else there. Okay, so here's this shoreline after it was hit by Hurricane Milton. Here's what the damage. You can see what the damage was. Here's if we build the seawall. Here's what it will cost. Here's what we might save if we got hit on Milton again. Here's the adaptive one. It might cost a little bit more, but we might save a little bit more. And there's some other measures here too. And having the abilities to game this out, because it's also very hard for people to understand the benefits. They can see the costs up front. But how do you basically start to create this decision environment? I'm sure insurance companies would love to know about this sort of thing. Maybe electeds might not want to hear it, but I guess as a way of saying is like, yeah, how do you want to advance this conversation as these tools evolve, and what capabilities do you need to add next? Go.
Yeah. So exactly like you're saying, the costs and like trying to lay out with the immersive tools, like the costs of doing nothing versus the cost of adaptation over time. And you'll find, you're saving money even though there's this upfront investment. So finding ways to incorporate in a visual way the dollars and cents associated with these different adaptations, I think would be a really cool next step. Also integrating live data. So there's different types of tide gauge. There's a couple different startups that are installing new tide gauges because NOAA only has a couple in our area. But to be able to incorporate real-time data, I could see that playing out really well for an evacuation scenario where you know exactly which routes are at risk in a flooding scenario, and you can kind of communicate that really clearly. I actually had, there was some flash flooding a couple years ago, and my car was damaged, and I wasn't parked in a flooding area. I would have known better if there was signage or anything like that, but I would have known really well to move my car if there was some sort of live data synchronization, a digital twin of sorts, that could text people exactly when and where the risks are so they can get out of the way. I think that type of smart cities, movement that we're all headed towards is really exciting and can save lives.
That program has been piloted in Hong Kong, actually. Block level weather prediction that will actually text you and tell you to move your car to higher ground. So yeah, bringing that into the models would be powerful. Alan.
So this one's really tough, especially in the fire space. We've been seeing insurers leave markets left and right. And I have asked every single person I possibly can, from anybody who knows anything about the insurance space. I've been asking them, what data do you need at the regional, at the home level, at what scale, and at what data do you need to feel comfortable that you can insure our community? And crickets, because it's either evaluated at a regional scale that's above sort of that household, neighborhood, county scale, as far as the way insurance markets work, or they just do not specifically have specific recommendations, or they just won't tell you. And so we're left guessing right now. And it's a very awkward place to be in, because multifamily structures in particular are the ones who are having their insurers leave quickest, that we're finding. We don't know fully exactly why that's the case, but our multifamily structures also tend to have more of our lower income residents as well, so it's a huge, huge, huge problem. But it is a question I am asking everybody I possibly can, is what data do you need from us for us to collect so that you can insure us and our communities and our families? Because if you can't get insurance, you can't get a home loan, you can't build your house, and you'll have tons of other ripple effects down the line. So as far as the expansion of what data would be needed, that is an open question, particularly in the fire space from an insurance standpoint, that we're really struggling with. And so I ask that question everywhere I go.
All right, well, a year from now, we'll come back here and we'll talk about how you guys are building digital twins, incorporating this real-time data and feeding this out here. And yeah, and by then, Sarah will have vibe-coded something really cool that'll help bind it all together. So a round of applause for our panelists here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And special thanks to both our friends at inCitu for helping organize the session and bringing them here from Hawaii and from Tampa. And thanks, of course, to all of you for joining us today here at South by Southwest. So thank you so much. We'll be around if you have any other questions. But yeah, enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you.